All right, we're going to jump into talking about altitude. And for altitude, we're going to talk about how to categorize it, the physiology, acute responses, acclimation or chronic responses, performance, and then training high. So how do we categorize altitude? Um, I will ask you to reference this chart, and I expect you to understand patterns in this chart, but I don't expect you to memorize this chart. Okay, so low altitude, 0 to 1500 meters, 1500 to 3500 is high. Very high is 3500 to 5500, and then extreme is 5500 to 8850, which is the highest point on Earth. Okay, so just for reference, what that means, and I translated into feet here for you, and the references are in feet as well. But Boise, where I'm from, the elevation is 2,703 feet above sea level. In Salt Lake, we're at 4,265 feet above sea level. Okay, so low altitude here. We don't expect a change in VO2 max or performance as a result of low altitude exposure. Okay, so if someone, for example, traveled from sea level to Salt Lake, we would not expect a decrease in performance as a result of that level of altitude change. Does that mean that some people could experience it still? Yes, spaghetti plots, remember, right? Some individuals may be highly susceptible for whatever reason. They could experience it. We don't expect it, though. High altitudes, right? So again, for reference, the living room, which is a common hike about 5 minutes away, it's up right by the Natural History Museum, just south of that. Okay, that takes you up to 5,700 feet, or if you go all the way up to Mount Wire, which is a continuation of that hike, up to 7,100 feet. That's putting us now into the high altitude category. Park City's elevation is at about 7,000 feet. Okay, and Bald Mountain, which is I think is the tallest peak in Park City, I think, is 9,400 feet. So again, all within high altitude ranges. Cusco is the largest metropolitan city. So this is in Peru. Largest metropolitan city in the world, sitting at 11,152 feet. Okay. So really high. Now at this point, right, if my VO2 max was 60 at baseline, I expect it to have gone down anywhere from 46 to 58. So definitely going to see a reduction. Now, and you do need to know this, and it comes from your text, but decrements in performance start at around 1,200 meters. So right? That's sitting actually here. Okay, so the very high end of low altitude, I could see some decrements. Okay, not often, but I do see it. Okay, then beyond 1,200 meters, for every 1,000 meter increase, VO2 max decreases by 10%. Sorry, every 1,000 meters, 10% decrease. Okay. So, right, we would see 5K time is going to then increase. But with acclimation, okay, and I don't know why I said 1 to 2 weeks. It typically takes 2 to 3 weeks for full acclimation. Um, with acclimation, we still don't get back to baseline. VO2 does not return to baseline with acclimation to altitude. You can get back about 50%. Okay. So after 2 weeks, I would expect 50% of whatever I lost will come back. Okay. So if I lost, let's say 10 puts me sort of right in the middle. If I lost 10 mLs per kg per minute, okay, based on the change in altitude, I could get 5 of those back with acclimation, but I didn't return to baseline. Okay. Then very high, Mount Timpanogos barely puts us very high, 11,752 feet. Kings Peak is the highest peak in Utah at 13,528 feet. El Alto is the highest point at which I think people live in the world, okay, at 13,615 feet. And again, significant reduction in VO2 max here, significant increase in performance time with improvements with acclimation. And then extreme, Mount Denali is, I think, the highest peak in Alaska, if I remember right. Mount Everest being the highest peak in the world. Um, again, massive reductions in VO2 max, increases in 5K time with significant improvements with acclimation. Okay, so acclimation is really important here. So what's happening, right? I climb a mountain, whatever. What's happening is we see decreased atmospheric pressure, which decreases the partial pressure of oxygen. So I still have the same percentage of oxygen in the air, but it's just in one space, there is less oxygen in one cubic area of space, there's less oxygen, which then decreases the diffusion gradient. So I'm bringing in that air where oxygen is less dense, essentially. I'm bringing that air into my lungs. Oxygen diffuses from my lungs, right, into my capillaries, but that diffusion gradient isn't as high anymore, right? So we've decreased that diffusion gradient, and that then decreases the oxygen content in my arteries, right, in the capillaries, okay? So then what happens? We see increased ventilation rate with altitude. We see increased cardiac output, so increased heart rate, and increased urine production. So these play in together quite a bit. So we see increased ventilation, which results in alkalosis. So what's happening is I'm increasing ventilation, right, to try to get that oxygen in. Okay. That then causes me to expel excess amounts of CO2. CO2 is slightly acidic. So if I'm expelling an acidic gas, right, then my body is going to become more basic, okay? And there are serious problems if it gets too basic. So the body compensates for that by increasing urine, and I start peeing out bicarbonate. Okay, now bicarbonate is slightly basic, okay? And so I can then, if I pee out a basic substance, right, my body becomes a little more acidic. So those two sort of balance each other out, right? But with increased ventilation, I can see um, some water loss. And I can also see, right, water loss with urine. So dehydration becomes really important here. Um, One of the things that can result is AMS, or acute mountain sickness, typically occurring above 2,500 meters. So I'm not going to expect it below that. There are some cases, I think, of it happening at around 2,000 meters, but that's not common. So that might be that those factors were compounded by things like pre-existing dehydration. So, right, I'm being dehydrated by the dry air and the urination, which can lead to a sore throat and bronchitis. It can also lead to that acute mountain sickness, which if I am above 2,500 meters especially, but as altitude increases, generally speaking, the recommendation is to reduce to 85% of your heart rate max or 85% of your VO2 max. You may also prescribe a mild diuretic, okay? So what that's going to do, right, is essentially increase that urine, right, combating that alkalosis that's going to happen from hyperventilation. One other complication that can happen is HACE or HAPE. So we're looking at cerebral edema and pulmonary edema. So high altitude, HA is high altitude cerebral edema, and then high altitude pulmonary edema. All that means is there's swelling in the brain or the lungs. So what can happen, right, is that I see vasoconstriction is one of the acute responses as well to cold exposure, because I'm trying to hold heat in. I'm trying to lose less heat from, right, evaporation, from convection, from radiation. And so if I decrease skin blood flow by vasoconstricting, then that can help me to maintain core body temperature. But what that also does is, right, when I vasoconstrict, I increase blood pressure. Okay, if I increase blood pressure, then I can actually see some leaking of fluid out of the blood vessels, and that leaking of fluid then causes edema or inflammation, buildup of fluid um, in the brain and the lungs, and both of those can be fatal. They can kill you. They're not common at all, though. Your book covers that a little bit, so I don't go into it too much here. This is just some data supporting what I've already said, right? But that at altitude, no significant difference in VO2 max between 500 and 1,000 meters. But as soon as we get to that 12,000 meter mark or 1,200 meter mark, right, we do see now a statistically significant decrease from baseline with, again, if we follow this down, about a 10% decrease in VO2 max with every 1,000 feet increase. Okay, same thing here, comparing sea level to 4,000 meters, oxygen consumption, and then cardiac output, right? Cardiac output, of course, does go up. VO2 max, right? Max is suggested by this final point. VO2 max, right? Here we were maybe about 3.5 liters per minute. If we go up to 4,000 meters, okay, which I should expect to see just under a 30% reduction, come down to here, I'm looking at about 2.5 meters, and I think that's a 28% reduction. So pretty damn close to what we expect with the standard. Now, there's some really fun research by two physicians, Levine and Stray Gunderson, that showed that living high, so these both represent living high, this is training low, and then training high, that both living high and training low and living high and training high resulted in increases in maximal oxygen uptake. Okay. What they failed to account for was changes in training. So both groups who engaged or were living at high altitude were given specific training regimens for that high altitude training. The group who lived low and trained low was asked to continue their current training. Okay. So these are not robust results because the protocols were completely different. So in repeat studies, what we see is, right, if I compare, so this is absolute and relative changes in VO2 max, but that actually in all reality, it looks like VO2 max does not significantly change as a result of training high, okay, or even as a result of living high. And in fact, well-controlled studies suggest that VO2 max, similar to what we saw in this chart, maybe it hates me, you guys. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to click on it. What we saw in this chart, right, is that yes, can VO2 max rebound? Yes, it can, but does it rebound to baseline levels? No, it actually doesn't. So in any case, that training high, right, is based on bad science. It's based on this science, and it's simply not robust, but takes a long time for us to get rid of tradition and yeah, tradition, I think. Um, there is some suggestion that there are physiologic changes as a result of altitude exposure that could improve performance, though. So we do typically see increases in hemoglobin content, and some data suggest increases in red cell volume as well, with increases in erythropoietin. So this is data that shows that, right? We see that sea level conditions, then exposure to altitude. At exposure to altitude, we saw increased hemoglobin content. We saw that come back to baseline about 16 days after returning to sea level. So again, this is an acute change. Your body is adapting both directions. So if I were exposed to high altitude just prior to performance, that then could maybe be an effective strategy. But ultimately, long term, is it going to result in improvements? No. So training high for whatever reason, right? That's actually it's not actually a good strategy long term because your VO2 max decreases. So actually your ability to train at high intensities is diminished at higher altitudes. This also looked at hemoglobin. Oh, and this one compared, so this one was comparing directly. I think this was live high, train high. This was live low, train. No, this was live low, train high. This was live high, train low, and this was whatever one I missed. In any case, the only one that saw significant improvements was the live low, train high group. So if you're living low and training high, yes, can we see that adaptation in hemoglobin? Yeah, probably. What we do see more consistently is increased buffering capacity. So this was a live high, train low group. Um, and in the live high, train low group, I think I said that wrong. This was also the live high, train low group. I might have said that wrong. So living high, training low, right? We are trying to take advantage of the potential adaptations of altitude while not seeing decreases in performance during our training. And they did find improvements in buffering capacity with this group. And then here, they saw decreased lactate at a given workload. So at 25, 50%, and 75% of VO2 max, we saw decreased lactate production. So again, improvements in buffering capacity, ability to maybe utilize lactate a little bit better with that high exposure. So if I'm training high, dehydration is a serious risk. We've already covered hydration strategies in the heat lecture. We see decreased performance. So general recommendations are don't work above 85% of your heart rate max, approximately a 10% decrease in VO2 max per 1,000 meters, right? Above 1,200 meters. Recommendations are that you ascend 600 meters a day for 2 days. Okay, that's generally, if you're going to ascend, that's a good starting point. Above 3,000 meters, they encourage 3+ days of staging, followed by 500 meters per day for 3 to 4 days. So you can ascend approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters, but then you should be staging there to help your body acclimate before moving on. You can combine this to just say 305 meters per staged day up to 1,400 feet. So go up 300 meters, stage for a day. Go up another 300, stage for a day. Go up another 300, stage for a day, right? So just different ways of saying the same recommendation. So there are reductions in cardiac output and VO2 max at altitude. So if training at altitude, then what should I do? The recommendation right now is small muscle mass activity, which can improve mitochondrial and capillary density. We could still see that improvement in buffering capacity, but you're not going to improve your VO2 max at altitude because your VO2 max is significantly reduced at altitude. So I shouldn't really be focusing on large muscle mass activity. So this is engaging in single leg cycling, right? So I'm focusing on more localized muscle mass. All right. I guarantee there are questions on this for exam 2, and I'm 90% sure for your final exam. So this is good practice for you. So Maya's sea level VO2 max is 52. She travels from 300 meters at home to train at 2,400 meters for 2 weeks, then races at 3,000 meters immediately after that. I should have specified. So from 300 meters to 2,400 meters, estimate the percent drop and the new VO2 max. Then from 2,400 to 3,000 meters, estimate the additional drop and race day VO2 max. Note, she trained at 2,400 meters for 2 weeks, so something should have happened during that time frame. You can calculate that. I have given you enough information to calculate that. In 1 or 2 sentences, you should be able to explain the physiology driving the decreases in VO2 max. If Maya's sea level 10K pace then corresponds to 85% VO2 max, should she keep that same absolute pace at 2,400 and 3,000 meters? Why or why not? And then list 2 practical adjustments for the first 3 to 5 days at 2,400 meters. This is the kind of analysis I expect you to be able to do. Again, answers in the slide notes. Again, jump on perusal, help your classmates out here. The last thing we're going to cover with altitude is aerobic versus aerodynamic. So one of the things that often comes up is, okay, well then if that's the case, if altitude decreases VO2 max, why do we see so many Olympic records broken, for example, at the Kearns Oval? Okay, well, the Kearns Oval is, right, we just said Salt Lake is 4,200 feet, right? It's occurring right about here, okay? As we go up in altitude, right, we do see decreased air density as well, right? That's part of the problem with VO2 max. So at some point, right, those two factors interact because if I see decreased air density, I can improve my aerodynamics, particularly for high-speed sports. So this was created by Jim Martin, who teaches here. He teaches a class called Maximizing Human Performance. If you take it, you will see this. I think it's a fun class if you want to explore different adaptations of training. His emphasis is particularly on cycling. So anyway, can pull some interesting stuff out of that class. But in any case, right, what we see is VO2 max and air density, right? Air density decreases consistently with increase in volume, but at some point it looks like the ratio seems pretty optimal, and it looks like that happens anywhere from like 4,200 feet up to maybe somewhere around 5,000 feet. So that's going to be the biggest bang for my buck, particularly in sprint style events where VO2 max is not a significant predictor of performance. Okay. In longer events, right, I might see that ratio differ a little bit. In any case, pretty interesting stuff, I think. So altitude review, acute response, we see decreased VO2 max, decreased performance. With acclimation, there's conflicting results on red cell volume, but typically we see increased red cell volume with increased erythropoietin. No change in VO2 max. We do see, sorry, I should have reworded that. We see about a 50% recovery with acclimation. So you're never reaching back to baseline, but about a 50% recovery, and you should have used that in your case study practice. We also see increased buffering capacity and decreased lactate at a given workload. So does altitude exposure then improve sea level performance? ultimately, I would say no, right? There may be some improvement in buffering and lactate capacity, and especially if you were living high, you decreased volume significantly, focused on small muscle mass activity during your training at higher altitudes, and then you competed within 2 weeks of dropping below. But should I just go train at altitude and then come back to training at sea level and continue my training and think that's going to help? No, there's not actually evidence to support that. Um, so when training high, you should compensate for central limitations. There's going to be a reduction in VO2 max. So focusing on that small muscle mass activity might be more helpful. And also there is a difference between aerobic and aerodynamic, right? And there's some balance between the two in terms of performance. Okay, we're going to jump right into cold exposure. I don't go too in depth here. I mainly rely on your book here, but a couple of things. So acute responses to cold, we see reduced skin blood flow, which decreases convective heat loss. Okay, so we talked about increasing skin blood flow, which then can help increase sweat rate during heat exposure. The opposite's going to happen during cold exposure. Reduced skin blood flow, decreased convective heat loss. And then shivering thermogenesis is the other major one. So involuntary skeletal muscle contraction, which increases my metabolic rate by 2 to 5 times, okay, which then is producing heat to help me stay warm. We also see a little bit, so focus on those first two, but a little bit of non-shivering thermogenesis through brown adipose tissue. We see increases in peripheral resistance, so increased blood pressure, increased sympathetic nervous system activity, which can increase heart rate and increase ventilation rate, which then decreases CO2 and can lead to respiratory alkalosis. So we saw that in the altitude section as well. So right, altitude and cold could have compounding effects there, which again might be leading to some of that acute mountain sickness, right? Because we're going to see that cold and altitude combining to negatively impact cardiovascular and respiratory function. We also see decreased muscle temperature, decreased enzyme activity, decreased nerve conduction, decreased power, and increased muscle stiffness. So all of those things are going to then impact performance. Chronic adaptations then, right? We should see some parallels here. So targeted vasoconstriction. So I say targeted because we're going to see vasoconstriction close to the surface, so close to the skin in my peripheral blood vessels, whereas I actually could see some slight dilation closer to, or at least relative dilation closer to my core. Skin temperature drops faster and with less discomfort, right? So that vasoconstriction is doing a really good job of quickly reducing heat loss when exposed to cold. We do see slightly decreased shivering or a decreased shivering threshold rather. So you start shivering sooner, right? Again, similar to the vasoconstriction, we see improved vasoconstriction to decrease heat loss. Similarly here, we see a decreased shivering threshold, so that happening sooner to help maintain core body temperature. Long term, we can see some small increases in brown adipose tissue, which can then increase resting metabolic rate, which helps maintain core body temperature. We also may see decreased resting heart rate to compensate, though. So decreased resting heart rate would then decrease resting metabolic rate a little bit. So those two factors may help cancel each other out a little bit, but really focusing on that targeted vasoconstriction and the decreased shivering threshold. Behavioral adaptations, right? Improved tolerance. That may be partly the result of, right? We see increased sympathetic nervous system activation with cold exposure, but acclimation may result in decreased sympathetic nervous system exposure. And then clothing management is the big one there, though, right? Dressing appropriately for cold exposure, right? Decreasing convective, radiative heat loss, especially. Also decreasing evaporative cooling as well if you're putting on layers of clothing. Time course, there's partial adaptation within 5 to 10 days, full adaptation within 2 to 3 weeks of repeated exposure, and deacclimation happens in a similar time frame. So that's similar to what I was saying with that altitude exposure, right? Acclimation happening right around 2 weeks. That's also what we saw with heat exposure as well. And then deacclimation does happen. For cold exposure and performance, we do see decreased VO2 max. We also see, power, speed, and flexibility all decline, right? Because muscle temperature is changing. Decreased fine motor skills. So I should then engage in protective clothing, right? It's a key determinant of performance, and it prevents cooling of the core. Cold plus altitude is a compounding stress, right? So higher, which results in higher carbohydrate reliance and increased ventilatory drive. So that hyperventilation is going to be increased, right? We've already sort of talked about that. Um, when addressing cold injury, there are two primary ones. So hypothermia, which is your core temperature risk, frostbite, which is your skin temperature risk. Things that increase risk, especially of hypothermia, are immersion in water. So rain, wet clothes. Then you combine that with windy conditions, right? We should be thinking about evaporative and convective cooling there. Low body fat, if you're greater than 60 years of age, we typically see increased risk. Hypoglycemia, right? If I don't have energy, then I can't increase resting metabolic rate. I can't shiver appropriately. Additionally, consumption of recreational drugs and alcohol, which we can see decreased sympathetic nervous system activity there. We also see decreased sensitivity in general. So maybe you are experiencing hypothermia, but you're not sensitive to that. With frostbite, age, temperature, wind speeds, and wetness are also all risks. So similar to the wet bulb globe temperature, we also have a risk here, right? So if I'm looking at temperature and then this is looking at wind speed, if wind speed is going up and temperature is going down, we're going to see increase or greater risk. So at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, right, which we absolutely see that here in Utah. We definitely get into some low negatives sometimes. If that is paired with high wind speed, so it's really not atypical for us to have 5 and 10 mile an hour winds. That's still pretty low risk, but especially in places like Davis County, or if you're doing some type of hiking, those can definitely get up to 30 miles an hour. And if it's 30 miles an hour and you're in -5 or 10, and especially if you're going up in altitude, we're going to probably expect to see even colder temperatures. So you might be getting up to that -10, -15. Now risk for frostbite increases dramatically, right? And that can occur in as little as 10 minutes. Okay. That's going to be further compounded if you are wet. Okay. So if you are wet and it's cold and it's windy, you're at extremely high risk for frostbite. So you want to be really, really careful. This is by the way, it's called the wind chill temperature index, and it's calculated for walking at speeds of 3 miles per hour. Also, even if you're wearing protective clothing, one thing that people often don't protect is their face. So we often see, right, the nose getting frostbite first. So, okay, I think that's where we're going to end. Quick recap. Heat, primary risk is dehydration, cardiovascular strain, reduced performance. We see with adaptation or acclimation, increased plasma volume, earlier sweating, lower core temperature. So we want to acclimate, hydrate, and use cooling strategies. For altitude, hypoxia, right? That lower partial pressure of oxygen is a risk. We can see increased dehydration partly because of that ventilation. Acute mountain sickness is definitely a concern, and decreased VO2 max. You should know exactly what that 10% per 1,000 meters above 1,200 meters is. Key adaptations, we can see increased buffering capacity, decreased lactate at a given threshold, sometimes increased erythropoietin and red blood cell volume. Generally, we would say ascend gradually, less than 6,000 meters per day. So that 305 meters per day or per staging day is a good strategy. Hydrate, reduce intensity to less than 85% of your heart rate max. With cold exposure, hypothermia and frostbite are our major concerns. We see decreased muscle and power coordination. See decreased muscle power and then coordination or fine motor skill. Peripheral vasoconstriction does improve. We see increased metabolic heat or increased shivering, and then engaging in behavioral strategies primarily there. For hydration, so layered clothing, staying dry, limiting exposure to wind are key strategies for cold exposure. For hydration, you should be familiar with pre, during, and post-exercise strategies. 0.1 ounces per pound 4 hours prior to exercise, with an additional 0.05 ounces per pound if you haven't urinated or if urine is dark in color. The Galpin equation is used for events lasting longer than 60 minutes. I don't think I covered that adequately earlier on, but for events lasting less than 60 minutes, we actually don't require, especially not carbohydrate and protein consumption. You still probably should consume some fluid, but even if you didn't, post-exercise hydration is probably sufficient. But for during exercise lasting longer than 60 minutes, you should include sodium, potassium, carbohydrate, and protein, and be familiar with what those amounts are. And then post-exercise, 17 ounces per pound of weight loss for rehydration. Okay. All right. I'll see you in class, but this week you'll have the week 8 notes due, the week 8 post-class engagement, And then coming next week, we have exam two. I'm not doing a pre-class engagement for next week, so that is your study. I have a study guide. It will be posted. And then next week on Monday, we will do a review prior to the exam on Wednesday. Okay. All right. That's all I have for you, and I will see you in class.